Ladies and gentlemen, E3 2017 has drawn to a close. During the time of E3, Microsoft took to the stage and proclaimed the Xbox One X as the most powerful games console available, snatching the crown from the PlayStation 4 Pro by Sony. Immediately after that, Sony have issued various statements, interviews, and of course pushing the fact that they have a lot of exclusive games, and games being the most important factor on any console, which of course it is. But some of their statements are somewhat contradictory to what they had said just a year or two ago. And my name's Paul, and in this RedGamingToday.com video we're going to be investigating a few of those for fun. For example, the PlayStation Global Sales and Marketing Head, Jim Ryan, recently was conducting an interview with Eurogamer. Obvious questions to ask was, what about the difference between the Xbox One X and the PS4 Pro? Are you worried about the difference in image quality, and is that going to perhaps affect things in the minds of gamers? He said, and I quote, "What I do is cast our minds back to the PS3 generation, where we had on paper more impressive specifications than our competition, and in some areas by quite a considerable margin. Now, that didn't play out how we anticipated it would. And this is nothing to do with co-marketing deals. This, in general, is developer and publisher dynamics. What happened was the developers, maybe at the behest of publishers, developed up to the lowest common denominator and just stopped there. In a very few cases, they actually took advantage of the additional horsepower of the PS3. I am a big believer in learning lessons from history, and history doesn't always repeat itself, but if you're a publisher for video games, and that is a perfectly commercially rational approach to take, because you only do one set of work and you don't do a set of work to get up to another level and then do a different amount of work, and then consequently may need to go further, end quote. Oh boy, I have a number of issues with those statements, and this video would be really long if I started to do an in-depth technical analysis between the PS4 Pro, the Xbox One X, which I still dislike the name of, but whatever, and, of course, the PS3 and Xbox 360. Now, first things first, let's get it right out of the way. One of the reasons that the developers and publishers did not take full advantage of the of the PS3 hardware was it was a bitch to program for. The architecture was plumb confusing to many, SDKs were not exactly the best on launch, and this is one of the reasons that the PlayStation 4 Pro and the PlayStation 4 were developed with simplicity in mind. You might recall Sony's own Mark Cerny talking about this subject known as time to pixel. In other words, the time it took for developers to actually get something, anything working on screen, a character, or some test screen, something.
The entire development environment was in a very primitive state. The first-party teams were having a hard time of it, but the third-party teams, without the luxury of just being able to focus on PlayStation 3, and without the benefit of our early start, were having an even more difficult time of it.
And basically he said that there was a graph which showed that the PS1 was really damn easy, PS2 was a bit harder but still quite, not too bad at all, and PS3 just pretty much went up the cliff face. And so what he heard back from developers when he was discussing things is that, hey, we need this to be a lot easier, we need a simplified architecture. The 360 had a couple of other advantages when it came to the GPU. The first was the inbuilt EDRAM, which did increase memory bandwidth. It obviously was a very small amount, only 10 megabytes, but it did help in some cases, especially with things such as anti-aliasing. And the second was it did have a unified architecture, which was yet another advantage. When it came to the CPU side of things, things were a lot more tricky. The 360 definitely had an easier time of it when it came to, programmability and that type of stuff, but the PS3's CPU was very powerful, and probably more powerful than the 360's overall. Do know that there is a lot more we could discuss here. We could discuss memory and how it's split up between the PS3, GPU and CPU, and the unified architecture on the 360. Both have their advantages and disadvantages, and I think few would disagree when I said that some games on the PS3 looked bloody impressive. If you were to say, look at The Last of Us, it looked amazing. In fact, it's almost, apart from maybe a slightly lower resolution, it almost looked like an entry-level PS4 game. It looked that damn good. Getting onto this generation specifically, though, Andrew House, of course, of PlayStation, actually had an interview.
I'd point to two things. I think that in terms of raw power, and particularly expressed in graphic processing, I think it's a phenomenal device that we will see more and more differentiation on that aspect over time.
And he said that as the generation went on, we would see more developers taking advantage of the power of the PS4. In other words, the gap would widen between the Xbox One and the PS4. And indeed, we did see that. In fact, that's one of the reasons that we did stop doing graphical comparisons on the channel. Because early on, we were doing a lot of them between the the Xbox One and the PS4. But then it just became to the point where it's like, it's kind of, redundant now. Because almost all the time, the PS4 would have the frame rate advantage, or the graphical advantage, or the resolution advantage, and of course the Xbox One would fall behind. That's not to say that there weren't interesting cases. There were cases where the frame rate of the Xbox One version of the game might be a bit higher, which we saw in Assassin's Creed, and other games where, to be honest, there wasn't that much graphical difference. Here's the thing though, if you actually look at the CPU and GPU difference between the two machines, it's fairly obvious that the Xbox One X does have an advantage over the PS4 Pro. In fact, just talking about the GPU for a moment, if you take 6, which is the number of T-flops in the Xbox One X, and then you divide that by the amount of performance in the PS4 Pro, which is about 4.2, and then you take that number, and then you save that for a second, and then you look at the PS4's GPU, which is 1.84 T-flops, and divide that by 1.31 of the Xbox One, then the number, in other words, the difference, the percentage of difference between the two GPUs, or rather the two sets of systems, is roughly the same. And thus is a pretty good comparison point. Understand, I'm not defending Microsoft here. They do have the most powerful console, but we are still seeing that console already have checkerboard upscaling for certain games when it comes to 4K, and some games are only running at 30 FPS. But to both Microsoft's and Sony's credit, it is down to developers how they choose to utilize the resources of a particular console. In other words, they can't choose or force them to run at 60 frames per second or choose for them to run at a native resolution. It's really down to the developers to use those assets. But I genuinely do believe that there will be a lot of developers who do utilize the performance advantage of the Xbox One X. Now, perhaps not as much as if both systems were exactly at parity, but you've got to remember that a lot of games which are appearing on both the Xbox One and PS4, and I'm just going to call those two systems, their base names for a moment, also appear on the PC. For example, Destiny 2. What that means is that you're already having developers who now have an excuse to work on higher quality assets for at least two versions. Now, from what developers have said, and there's been a couple of interviews already and a couple of murmurs, the Xbox One X, God I prefer the name Scorpio, is roughly about on par with a GTX 1070. Now, obviously, as optimizations become a thing, as we get better development kits, and as developers get used to the hardware, that might change, it might go up a little bit, but let's, for the sake of argument, say that it's about on GTX 1070 levels. In a year or two, the GTX 1070 is going to be pretty slow, to be honest with you, but right now it's still a very good card. If you've got a GTX 1060, hell, you're pretty happy. So, since AMD and Nvidia generally partner with games developers, like if you've ever loaded up a PC game, there's a very good chance you've seen Nvidia the way it's meant to be played, or the AMD logo popping up, or whatever. And that's just, of course, because they've got an investment. Now, whether you like GameWorks or whatever, that's beside the point for this particular video. It does mean that they're working with developers to increase the graphical quality of games. In other words, you've got advanced lighting, you've got advanced shadows, so you've got higher resolution textures and all of this stuff. In other words, games are being created for a wider ecosystem now. And quite often, one of the ways that developers can help bring PC sales in is if PC gamers know, oh look, it's actually a case where the developers put in this extra work for the PC version. So if they are creating those higher quality assets, those assets are inherently going to then be usable on the Scorpio. In some cases, they may need to downgrade them. In other cases, they may not be there. For example, they might have to remove, say, reflections in this area, or they might need to perhaps lower the foliage density in that area, or whatever the case may be, or perhaps just have a lower quality of, lower frame rate. But ultimately, it is down to developers to do that. From a personal standpoint, I am much more of a PC gamer. I prefer the overall ecosystem of PC. I like the fact that you can mod games, I like the fact that games are cheaper, and personally, in general terms, I prefer the control scheme and everything else that goes with it. But, for 3 years now, the PlayStation ecosystem has been kicking the ass of Microsoft in terms of hardware performance, and undoubtedly it's one of the reasons that the PlayStation had an advantage in terms of sales figures over the Xbox. Now, you can also argue about the Kinect as well, but the fact that the Kinect was bundled in with the Xbox One at launch, it cost more money and the performance was lower, obviously that just didn't do much for consumer confidence. It basically meant that you were paying more cash for what many consider to be an inferior product. After all, if you're not utilising Kinect, why would you buy it? You just don't want it. What we have here is very simple. It's just the peaks and troughs of each console. One console's released, another console obviously falls behind in terms of performance. And make no mistake, the Xbox X is more expensive, it's going to cost you more monies, and therefore it's obviously going to have a hardware advantage. That's not too difficult. It's the same as if you're building a PC. If you're spending like $300 on a GPU and your friend Johnny's only spending $180, then obviously your GPU is going to be faster, and it's very much the same case here. So, does this mean that Xbox is suddenly going to outsell the PlayStation? Probably not. Does it mean that Sony are going to have to change its marketing slogans and no longer able to say the world's most powerful console, which it constantly did, of course? Yes, it will. Does that mean that PlayStation is going to come back swinging with the next PlayStation, whatever that's going to be, which we assume is going to be the PlayStation 5. I don't think they're going to release yet another version of the PS4. Hopefully, however, the PS5 will be back with the compatible Sony. Yes, they will. And of course, then it's down to Microsoft to try and preempt that and release the best hardware they can do. Release. So that's just kind of how it is. And frankly, I love that. And it's just the technology industry in a nutshell. And CPUs, GPUs are all going through the same thing. You've got Intel at the moment who have the Kaby Lake series of processors, and soon, of course, they're releasing the X299 platform. AMD are rabbit punching them with their various Ryzen/Threadripper lineup, and then you've got Nvidia pretty much dominating the GPU landscape at the moment, at least in the higher end, and then Vega's waiting in the wings, and many are wondering if it's going to be too late. It's just why I love the technology industry, and personally, from a consumer standpoint, I absolutely love it. It means that if you do want to buy a new console for high-resolution graphics for a 4K TV and you don't want a PC, or you can't afford a PC because ultimately the Scorpio/Xbox One X is cheaper than a full-blown PC which could run at comparable graphics, I'm just being honest with you, then you've got that ability. And I think that's pretty cool. Personally, I think if you've got a PlayStation 4, unless you really, really, really are invested in the PlayStation ecosystem and you've got a 4K TV, it's not worth buying a PS4 Pro. I say that as a PS4 Pro and a PlayStation 4 owner. And I would personally say that, hey, you should probably go with the Xbox One X and enjoy multi-platform games at higher resolution even than the PS4 Pro, but still have access to kick-ass exclusive games on the PlayStation. But obviously that's only my opinion, and it is what it is. Anyway, with all of that said, hopefully you've enjoyed the video. I'll see you soon. Take care. Bye for now.